When my grandfather passed away, he left me a massive piece of land on the outskirts of the city, 50 acres of untouched countryside that had been in our family for generations. It wasn't prime real estate at the time, but I knew it held history and value far deeper than any appraisal could show. The land was quiet, peaceful, and bordered by a small creek that shimmered under the morning sun. When I inherited it, people told me to sell, that it was wasted potential sitting out there doing nothing. But I saw something different. I saw my grandfather's legacy, the same soil he tilled, the same trees he planted, the same open fields he used to walk through every evening. I had no plans to build or develop anything. I just wanted to keep it in the family. Then came the Homeowners Association, an aggressive, shiny-suited army of developers who saw my family land as a perfect expansion opportunity for their luxury suburban community. It started with polite letters, offers to partner with me, promises of huge profits, and shared community benefits. I ignored them, thinking they'd lose interest when they realized I wasn't going to sell. But when I didn't respond, the tone changed. Their letters turned into notices. The notices became threats. They claimed they'd researched the area and that part of my land technically fell under their jurisdiction. That was ridiculous, of course, but they were clever. They used obscure zoning maps and vague legal jargon to make it sound legitimate. I went down to the county office myself and confirmed that my land was absolutely separate from theirs. It was mine, clear and undisputed. I thought that would be the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few months later, while I was visiting my sister in another state, I got a call from one of my old neighbors who lived on the far side of the property. "You better come back here," he said, his voice uneasy. "There's trucks rolling in on your land." I thought he was exaggerating until he sent me a video, cement mixers, bulldozers, and men in hard hats breaking ground right in the middle of my property. My stomach dropped. They weren't just encroaching a little, they were full-on building. I drove back overnight, furious and ready to confront whoever was responsible. When I got there, I couldn't believe my eyes. The once open fields were torn up, and half a dozen foundations had already been poured. There were survey flags, temporary fencing, and even signs reading future homes by Silver Pine Estates. That was the HOA's pet project, the same one that had been hounding me for months. I found the foreman and demanded to know who authorized this. He shrugged and handed me a permit that listed a shared development parcel. My name wasn't anywhere on it. I called the county office immediately, but they claimed they'd received amended paperwork transferring ownership. Someone had forged documents showing the land as part of the HOA's holdings. I hired a lawyer that same week, but she warned me it could take months to untangle the mess in court. In the meantime, the HOA kept building. They didn't slow down, not for 1 minute. I drive past and see row after row of wooden frames rising, streets being paved, lampposts installed, and landscaping crews planting shrubs. 96 homes went up in less than a year. 96 homes on land they didn't even own. Friends told me I should go public, maybe call the news or stage a protest. But I had a different idea. I knew exactly what I had. My grandfather's original deed, filed decades before any of these suburban expansions ever existed. I also knew that once I went to court, the HOA would have no legal footing to stand on. But here's the thing, I didn't want to stop them. Not yet. I wanted them to finish every house, pave every driveway, and hook up every utility. Because when they were done, I'd be holding all the cards. So I waited. I stayed quiet, watched, and collected evidence. Every time I passed the site, I took pictures, noted dates, and saved screenshots of their public listings, advertising brand new homes in a thriving community. They were even selling lots on my land. I let it all play out. I let them dig themselves deeper and deeper, thinking they were the smartest people in the room. It wasn't easy to keep my cool, especially when they started sending me smug letters thanking me for my cooperation, but patience was my weapon. When the last roof was installed and the final house was sold, that's when I made my move. The day I decided to strike back, the sun was barely up, but I'd already been awake for hours, pacing across my porch with a mug of coffee and a folder in my hand that contained every piece of evidence I had collected for over a year. Inside that folder was the original deed to my land, my grandfather's signature, the county stamp, and the coordinates that clearly defined the boundaries of what was rightfully mine. I also had copies of the fake documents the HOA had used, which my lawyer managed to retrieve through discovery. The contrast between the two sets of papers was laughable. One was authentic, aged, and historically recorded. The other was a sloppy forgery that some overconfident developer must have thought would never be checked. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Teresa Barnes, told me to be patient a little longer. They've already broken more laws than they realize, she said, flipping through the pages. If we play this right, you'll not only get your land back, you'll own everything sitting on it. Those words echoed in my mind every time I saw those shiny new homes glimmering on what used to be open farmland. 96 families had bought into a lie, and while I felt bad for them, I also knew the real villain was the HOA and the developers behind it. They'd built an empire on theft, and now that empire was sitting squarely on my foundation. For months, I prepared for the court battle quietly. The HOA board sent out newsletters bragging about their unprecedented growth and record property sales. They had no clue that the rug was about to be pulled out from under them. They had lawyers, of course, sleek, smug professionals who believed that money and influence could bulldoze through anyone who stood in their way. They'd underestimated me, just as they'd underestimated the importance of that deed sitting in my grandfather's old safe. I had all the patience in the world, while they hosted ribbon-cutting ceremonies and invited local officials to tour their new community. I was building my case brick by brick. Every utility connection, every zoning inspection, every property tax submission, they all pointed back to one thing: illegal development. My lawyer filed the lawsuit, quietly, no press, no drama. We simply let the papers do the talking. When the summons finally reached the HOA office, it caused a panic I could only imagine. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard through a friend who worked in the county building that the HOA president, a man named Richard Calloway, nearly had a breakdown. Apparently, he thought it was a joke until he realized the complaint was real and backed by the original property deed. The case was set for trial in the county courthouse within a few weeks, and once the news leaked, it spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. At first, the residents didn't believe it. They thought I was just some bitter landowner trying to get attention. But when they started receiving legal notices from their title companies about irregularities in property ownership, the panic set in. Open house signs came down overnight. Realtors stopped showing properties. Buyers backed out of pending deals. The HOA tried to calm everyone down by claiming it was just a clerical error and that everything would be sorted out soon. But by then, I had already met with county officials and proved that my deed predated their entire subdivision plan. The looks on their faces when they realized what had happened, pure shock. "You mean they built all that without proper title clearance?" one of the clerks asked me in disbelief. "Every single bit of it," I replied, "and now it's all mine." My lawyer smiled at that. She said we had a legal slam dunk. The only question now was how far we wanted to take it. Did we want damages, restitution, or full ownership of the built structures? I told her I wanted everything. Every brick, every fence, every mailbox. They built on my land, they used my property, and they'd pay for it one way or another. The first court hearing was packed. Residents sat in the back, whispering nervously. The HOA board members arrived looking smug at first, wearing suits and carrying binders full of legal arguments. But the moment my lawyer pulled out the original deed and displayed the date and seal for everyone to see, that smugness evaporated. Teresa explained everything clearly: my family's ownership, the forged documents, the illegal construction, and the blatant fraud. The judge listened quietly, flipping through pages of evidence. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that land boundaries had shifted or that the legal descriptions overlapped due to outdated maps, but Teresa countered each argument with cold, hard facts. She even showed the judge an overlay map that proved beyond question that the entire subdivision was sitting directly on my property. The courtroom went silent. The judge leaned back, adjusted his glasses, and said, "So, to be clear, every one of these homes is built on land that does not belong to the HOA or its members?" Teresa nodded. "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge turned to the HOA's lawyer. "And you didn't verify ownership before beginning construction?" The man stammered something about assumed jurisdiction and clerical oversights, but the damage was done. You could almost feel the panic ripple through the room. After the hearing, I walked outside and stood on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind cutting across the plaza. Reporters had started gathering by then, asking for statements, but I said nothing. I didn't need to. The look on Richard Calloway's face when he passed me said it all. He knew it was over. Still, the final judgment hadn't been made yet, and I wasn't about to celebrate prematurely. I wanted the court's decision in writing before I made my next move. That night, I drove past the subdivision again. The lights were on in nearly every house. Families were inside, unaware that their dream homes were sitting on stolen ground. I watched from the roadside for a long time, torn between anger and satisfaction. They weren't my enemies, not really, but they were living proof of how reckless greed could ruin lives. I wasn't after them. I was after the people who had orchestrated the entire scheme. And soon, when the court finally ruled, they'd learn what it felt like to lose everything they'd built, literally and legally. When the judge finally issued his ruling, the room felt as if someone had flipped a giant switch. An electric hush followed by the frantic scuffle of papers and the low murmur of disbelief. The judgment was succinct and ruthless in its clarity. The deed filed by my grandfather decades earlier was valid, the documents submitted by the HOA were fraudulent, and by law the land and everything affixed to it belonged to me. The court ordered immediate cessation of any claims by the HOA and empowered me to take possession of the property and its improvements. It also scheduled hearings to determine damages, restitution, and the fate of the people who had engineered the scheme. I remember sitting in the gallery and feeling an odd mixture of triumph and dread. 96 homes, 96 families were suddenly standing on a legal fault line, and the responsibility to resolve that catastrophe fell on my shoulders as surely as the title now did. Outside, the media circled like vultures. Within hours, reporters were at my gate, microphones extended, asking how I felt, what I intended to do next. I gave them a simple answer. The law had been served, and now I would do justice, not vengeance. But justice has many faces, and even with the law on my side, I knew the human cost would be messy and bitter. The HOA and their developers were hit first. Banks called in loans, investors demanded explanations, and within weeks the company's cash flow froze as insurers and lenders reassessed risk. The lead developer, a man who had once swaggered through council meetings like royalty, suddenly found himself fielding subpoenas and threats of criminal fraud charges. Local authorities opened an investigation into how permits had been issued without proper title verification, whispers of bribery and forged signatures surfaced, and several minor officials were placed on leave pending inquiries. The HOA board members attempted to regroup, issuing desperate letters to homeowners promising to assist with clarity and offering to cooperate fully with any transition, but those words sounded hollow against the weight of the court's finding. Buyers who had moved in faced a different crisis. Their mortgage lenders were furious and reluctant to finalize loans on properties with disputed titles. Title insurers quietly rescinded policies, and prospective buyers who had planned to move in within months canceled their plans. The human reaction was raw and immediate: anger, tears, and frantic attempts to salvage what they could. I received dozens of visitations, older couples who had sold everything to buy a peaceful retirement home, young families with newborns who'd assumed the future was secure, contractors who had poured sweat and time into finishing the build. They looked to me as both the owner of the land and the agent of the upheaval, which was an uncomfortable duality to bear. I met with groups of them in a barn on my property, the same one my grandfather had used as a workshop, and I listened while they poured out fears about foreclosure notices, job losses, and shattered dreams. I did not relish their pain, but I wasn't willing to let the real culprits walk away either. We reached a pragmatic, if stern, interim solution. The court allowed me to take possession, but recognized the practical need to avoid creating mass homelessness overnight. So, I offered a three-option plan to every homeowner, structured to be fair and to shift consequences back to those who had caused the harm. Option 1 was purchase of clear title. Any resident who wanted to keep their home could enter negotiations with me to buy the land under their house at a fair market price adjusted to reflect the legal mess, but not gouged for punishment. I set prices lower than typical market valuations because my fight was against the HOA and developers, not the people who had been deceived. Option 2 was a temporary lease. Residents could sign short-term occupancy agreements, paying rent to me while we sorted long-term solutions. I promised no evictions for 6 months while they arranged finances or alternative housing. Option 3 allowed residents to accept compensation, a cash settlement based on what they had paid plus reasonable relocation assistance, funded in part by the damages we aim to recover from the HOA and developers. The proposal wasn't perfect, and some accused me of profiteering. Others called me merciful. The truth lay somewhere between. I wanted to avoid mass displacement, but I also needed to assert control over my land and ensure the system that enabled the fraud paid for its crimes. Meanwhile, my legal team pursued damages and punitive reparations. We filed suits against the developers for fraud, against the HOA board for conspiracy and negligent oversight, and against a network of title companies that had failed to verify chain of title properly. Discovery exposed a rotten vine of collusion, emails showing developers celebrating creative paperwork, a now terminated county clerk forwarding dubious filings without verification, and internal HOA memos that joked about speeding up the process by cutting corners. The courts moved faster than I had dared hope. Temporary restraining orders froze developer assets, liens were placed on properties held by the HOA and related companies, and municipal officials faced public outcry that forced an internal overhaul of permitting procedures. In depositions, executives fumbled and gave contradictory testimony. Several lower-level conspirators began cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. The community's sympathy largely shifted toward me as the narrative clarified. This wasn't simply a landowner waging war on innocent buyers. This was a fight to hold accountable a system that had allowed greed to trump law. That shift mattered. It emboldened other agencies to act and made potential settlements with the developers more likely. As a practical matter, I opened a small office on the edge of the subdivision to manage everything. Staffed with paralegals, housing counselors, and social workers, the office became a hub for paperwork, negotiations, and emergency assistance. We organized legal clinics to help residents analyze their options, partnered with nonprofits to find temporary housing for those who needed it, and coordinated with lenders to explore refinancing or government programs that might help affected homeowners. The outreach eased tensions, but it couldn't erase anger. Some neighbors organized protests outside my office, others sent anonymous threats. A few families refused any offer and vowed to stay, turning their porches into impromptu barricades. I didn't try to force anyone out. Instead, I focused on transparency, showing receipts of settlements, explaining how restitution funds would be used, and publicly naming the developers and board members responsible. That transparency turned the tide of opinion further in my favor. Finally, the smaller matters, the mailboxes, the community garden plots, the HOA's gatehouse, became symbolic battlegrounds. I had the locks changed, but I left access to essential utilities intact while we reorganized ownership. I commissioned independent appraisers to value the houses and engaged auction houses to prepare for the unlikely event that owners couldn't or wouldn't legitimize their occupancy. Those auctions were a last resort, not a spectacle. In court, punitive damages were levied against the developers and several HOA officers, and as judgments piled up, bankruptcy filings followed for some corporate entities. The lawsuits recovered enough funds to cover a substantial portion of the settlements and to finance relocation assistance. The final chapter of what many called the subdivision scandal unfolded over many months. Appeals were filed, Some convictions were secured for those who had knowingly falsified records, and municipal reforms were enacted to prevent similar abuses. Through it all, I never lost sight of the personal cost. A herd of lives had been upended, and while the law had been vindicated, the moral scars would take longer to heal. Months rolled into a year, and what had once been a scandal splashed across every local newspaper gradually evolved into a slow, grinding reconstruction, legal, financial, and emotional. The land that had been my grandfather's inheritance was now a surreal patchwork of half-settled houses, for sale signs, and construction debris left behind after the developers fled into bankruptcy. The HOA office had been abandoned, its windows dark, its mailbox stuffed with uncollected notices from lawyers, lenders, and angry residents. But amid the wreckage, I began to see an unexpected opportunity not just to reclaim what was mine, but to rebuild it properly, ethically, and with a sense of purpose my grandfather would have approved of. The court's final rulings had confirmed everything. The deed was mine, the fraudulent developers owed massive damages, and all physical structures on the property were legally under my ownership. Many residents had already chosen one of the options I'd offered earlier. Some bought their land outright and became legitimate owners, others relocated with the compensation they received, and a smaller handful remained as tenants until their leases expired. But even as the legal dust settled, the emotional tension hung heavy in the air. Some residents still viewed me as the man who took their dream homes away, while others saw me as the one who saved them from a larger scam. I couldn't control their opinions. I could only control what came next. The first step was to deal with the physical space itself. Entire blocks of identical houses stood eerily quiet, their manicured lawns slowly fading as maintenance stopped. I hired a team of surveyors, urban planners, and environmental engineers to evaluate the subdivision. My instructions were simple: find out what's salvageable and what's not. Many of the houses were structurally sound, but others had been built hastily with cheap materials, foundations already cracking under the first year of settlement. Drainage was poor in some areas, and the stormwater system, as it turned out, had been illegally connected to the city's main sewer without proper permits. Fixing those issues would cost a fortune, but I had leverage now: the settlement money from the lawsuits and the damages the court had awarded me. I didn't want to build another soulless suburban grid. I wanted to create something meaningful. In quiet moments, I'd walk the same dirt paths my grandfather once took, thinking about how far things had come. He had protected this land, not for profit, but for legacy, and I realized that legacy meant more than simply owning it. It meant shaping what it would become. Still, before any rebuilding could start, there were loose ends to tie up. The county wanted its fees, the banks wanted their paperwork finalized, and the state environmental agency wanted assurance that no construction had contaminated the nearby creek. For months, I was buried in meetings, negotiations, and inspections. Teresa, my lawyer, stayed by my side through every step, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "You realize," she said one afternoon as we reviewed the last batch of settlement checks, "you could sell this entire property now and walk away a millionaire many times over." I looked out the window at the empty streets and thought of the history buried under them. "And then what?" I asked. "Let someone else destroy it again?" She smiled faintly and nodded. She knew me well enough to understand that this wasn't about money anymore. This was about balance, justice, closure. I had spent so long fighting for this land that I couldn't just cash out and leave. Instead, I started drawing plans for something new: a community center named after my grandfather, a public garden, maybe even a small museum detailing the story of the land and its battle against corruption. I wanted to turn the site from a symbol of greed into a lesson in accountability. News of my plans spread quickly, and public opinion began to shift. The same reporters who once questioned my motives now praised the landowner who beat the system and gave back to the community. Some former residents who had left under tense circumstances even reached out to thank me for not letting the HOA and developers get away with what they did. A few of them returned, hoping to buy back their homes legitimately this time. I welcomed them with open arms, offering fair deals without hidden fees or legal traps. We signed new contracts clean and transparent, and I watched as families who had once feared eviction began moving back in, this time with real ownership papers in their hands. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was steady. We cleaned up abandoned lots, repaired roads, and restored utilities under new management. The city, eager to rehabilitate its image after the scandal, even partnered with me on infrastructure improvements, granting permits quickly and funding partial repairs. For the first time since the ordeal began, the place started to feel alive again, not as a monument to greed, but as a community reborn from its ashes. Of course, not everyone approved. The surviving members of the old HOA, those who hadn't been charged, tried to launch smear campaigns online claiming I had stolen their development and profited off innocent homeowners. They filed appeal after appeal, all of which the courts dismissed almost immediately. Teresa handled them like swatting flies, each motion met with another reminder of the ironclad ruling in my favor. Their arrogance had finally collapsed under the weight of the law. One particularly vocal former board member even tried to confront me in person at a town hall meeting, shouting that I'd destroyed everything they'd built. I looked him straight in the eye and told him the truth. You destroyed it the moment you built it on land that wasn't yours. The room went silent and he walked out head bowed. It wasn't victory I felt in that moment, it was peace. The kind that comes when a long, ugly chapter finally closes. By the time the second anniversary of the ruling arrived, the land had changed again. The new community, now called Callaway Fields, ironically named after the disgraced HOA president as a permanent reminder of greed's cost, had become something extraordinary. We'd turned empty lots into parks, converted one of the unfinished cul-de-sacs into a farmer's market, and built walking trails that followed the line of the old creek. The families who stayed became the heart of a new, transparent association, not a profit-driven HOA, but a resident-run council focused on community, safety, and fairness. Every document, every meeting, every decision was made public, recorded, and archived so history could never repeat itself. Sometimes I'd stand at the edge of the property during sunset, the same place where I'd once watched the bulldozers tear through the soil, and I'd think about how close I came to losing it all. My grandfather's land had survived corruption, greed, and betrayal, and through it all, it had taught me something priceless. True ownership isn't about holding a title, it's about protecting the truth that title represents. And in the end, that truth had won. The months that followed the rebirth of Callaway Fields were filled with both challenges and small victories. Each day, another reminder that rebuilding trust takes longer than rebuilding houses. Even though most of the legal battles were behind us, the ghosts of the past still lingered in paperwork, in old property lines, and in the wary looks some of the residents gave me whenever I visited the neighborhood. I couldn't blame them. To them, I was both the savior who restored legitimacy and the man who had once held their fates in a courtroom file. But I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just wanted to see the land finally used with honesty and purpose. Every weekend, I'd drive through the winding streets, watching children ride their bikes along the sidewalks that had once been poured under false pretenses. Where there had once been hostility and fear, there was now laughter echoing through the air. The irony wasn't lost on me that something born of deceit had become a symbol of integrity. Still, it hadn't come easy. Many of the former HOA members were still entangled in lawsuits or appeals, and a few developers faced criminal trials for fraud and forgery. Those proceedings dragged on endlessly, but I attended every key hearing, sitting quietly in the back as evidence was presented, emails, bank records, signatures, all of it laid bare for the world to see. Watching those who'd once acted untouchable squirm under oath gave me no joy, just closure. I realized vengeance wasn't the goal anymore. Truth was. Teresa, and I continued to meet regularly, finalizing settlements and monitoring the trust fund created from the damages. Part of that fund went toward infrastructure and restoration, rebuilding sidewalks, upgrading the storm drains, and repairing the main bridge that connected Callaway Fields to the highway. The other part we set aside for education and community development. I wanted the next generation to learn from what happened, not repeat it. So, we launched the Silver Creek Scholarship, named after the stream that ran through the property, offering grants to local students pursuing studies in environmental law, civil engineering, and urban planning. The first time I met the scholarship recipients, bright, determined kids who spoke about ethics and sustainability with more passion than most politicians, I knew the land had finally begun to heal. Some of them even volunteered weekends to help with replanting native trees along the creek, undoing the environmental damage the developers had ignored. It was slow work, muddy and exhausting, but standing there with them, knee-deep in soil that had seen both greed and redemption, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace of mind. One of the biggest surprises came from the city council. The same officials who once turned a blind eye to the HOA's misconduct now wanted to partner on a new initiative, transforming the remaining undeveloped lots into a public green corridor that would connect Callaway Fields with the neighboring township. They offered grants, permits, and tax incentives, hoping to repair their damaged reputation. I was hesitant at first, but Teresa advised me to see it as an opportunity rather than a trap. They need you now, she said. That gives you leverage. Use it to make sure no one ever builds here illegally again. So, I drafted an agreement that made history in our county, a land covenant guaranteeing that a full third of the property would remain permanently undeveloped, protected as open space. The rest would be subject to strict transparency laws requiring any future construction to undergo triple verification on ownership, environmental compliance, and public consent. When the council voted unanimously to approve the covenant, it was the first time I'd felt genuine trust toward local government in years. Newspapers called it a landmark in land reform. For me, it was simply doing what my grandfather would have done, ensuring the land stayed pure. But rebuilding trust wasn't only about institutions, it was about people. I made it a point to attend every community meeting to listen when residents spoke, to answer questions directly instead of hiding behind lawyers. At first, the crowds were small and skeptical, but word spread that I wasn't there to dictate. I was there to listen. We discussed everything: property taxes, maintenance costs, security concerns, even simple things like adding more streetlights and organizing block parties. Gradually, the tone changed from suspicion to collaboration. One evening, during a particularly lively discussion about building a playground, an older man who'd been one of my harshest critics stood up and said, "We may not have trusted how this started, but I trust how it's ending." The room fell silent, then filled with quiet applause. It wasn't about winning approval, it was about earning respect. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but think of the few people who still refused to engage, the ones who had packed up and left after the ruling, their houses sold or repossessed. I sometimes drove past their empty homes, weeds creeping through driveways, mailboxes rusting. They reminded me that even justice comes with collateral damage. I had learned that no matter how righteous a victory feels, it always leaves behind a shadow. To balance it, I made it a mission to turn each scar into something useful. Abandoned lots became community gardens. One of the unfinished cul-de-sacs was repurposed as an outdoor classroom for local schools. Children came on field trips to learn about land rights, ecosystems, and civic responsibility. The same soil that once represented fraud now nurtured lessons in integrity. Seeing those kids plant flowers and vegetables where bulldozers once roared was poetic justice at its purest. Then, one spring afternoon, as I was walking the creek path with Teresa, she asked me something unexpected. "Do you ever wish you'd stopped them earlier?" she said. I paused for a long moment, listening to the water rush over stones. Every day, I admitted, but if I had, they'd have just tried again somewhere else. Letting them finish made everyone see what unchecked greed looks like when it collapses. She nodded slowly. "Then, I guess you didn't just win your land back, you changed how the system works." Her words stayed with me long after she left that day. Because maybe that was the real legacy of all this. Not the houses, not the money, but the change it sparked. Developers in nearby counties started tightening their due diligence, and the state legislature, even introduced a bill inspired by our case requiring mandatory pre-construction title verification on large projects. They called it the Land Integrity Act, but around here, people just called it the Callaway Law. The irony made me smile. The name of the man who once embodied deceit had become a symbol of accountability. At night, when the air was still and the lights of the new community glowed softly across the hills, I'd sit on my porch and look out over the land, no longer a battlefield, but a home. I'd think about my grandfather, about how proud he would have been to see his legacy protected not by wealth or vengeance, but by perseverance and principle. And as the wind rustled through the trees we'd replanted, I realized something profound. The fight had started because of what they took from me, but it ended because of what I chose to give back. As the seasons cycled through another year, the once turbulent story of my land and the infamous HOA faded from the front pages of local newspapers and settled quietly into the fabric of the community's history. Callaway Fields, once a symbol of corruption and arrogance, had become a thriving, self-sustaining neighborhood built on transparency and cooperation. Every street sign, every restored fence, every blooming tree seemed to whisper the same truth. What begins in deceit can end in redemption if someone refuses to give up. Yet even as the surface of life calmed, I knew that the story wasn't truly over. There were still ripples moving beneath the quiet. Unresolved cases, financial entanglements, and the lingering bitterness of those who had lost more than they could bear. The courts were still working through the criminal proceedings against the developers, and although most of the former HOA board members had accepted their fines and penalties, one of them, Richard Callaway himself, refused to go down quietly. He had vanished for nearly 6 months after the judgment, but word spread that he was back in the area threatening lawsuits, giving interviews to fringe media outlets, and claiming he'd been wronged by a rigged system. It was pathetic in a way, but also unsettling. I had learned long ago that men like him don't just disappear. They fester, waiting for a chance to strike again. One evening, as I was finishing paperwork in the small office I'd built near the community garden, Teresa called. Her tone was steady but serious. "You might want to come downtown tomorrow," she said. Callaway filed a new motion, claims he has new evidence proving the transfer of ownership was legitimate. I laughed, but she didn't. He's trying to stall, maybe regain attention, but it's still a legal filing. We'll handle it. I hung up and stared at the walls of my office for a long time, feeling that old flicker of irritation I hadn't felt since the early days of the battle. Why couldn't he just let it die? The next morning, we were in court again, a smaller hearing this time. Callaway stood across the aisle, thinner, his hair streaked with gray, but his arrogance was still intact. He'd hired a new lawyer, young, loud, and clearly inexperienced in real estate law. They presented what they called undisclosed amendments to zoning records, supposedly showing a boundary overlap that nullified my deed's western edge. It was laughable. Teresa calmly dismantled it within minutes, pointing out that the new evidence was based on maps already proven fraudulent in the original case. The judge didn't even take it under advisement. He dismissed the motion outright and sanctioned Callaway's attorney for wasting the court's time. Still, as we left the courthouse, Callaway glared at me across the parking lot, his expression venomous. "You think this is over?" he shouted. "You think you've won?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. But deep down, I knew men like him rarely go quietly. They cling to delusion like drowning men to driftwood. Sure enough, a few weeks later, small acts of vandalism began to appear around the community. Spray paint on walls, broken mailboxes, a tree cut down along the creek. Petty, childish things, but too deliberate to be random. I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, but the pattern was obvious. I installed security cameras, and the residents organized night patrols. One night, I caught him, Callaway himself, trespassing near the creek, flashlight in hand, trying to tear down one of the signs marking the conservation area. I didn't confront him directly. Instead, I called the sheriff, who arrived quietly and arrested him for trespassing and violating the restraining order that had been issued after his last courtroom outburst. Watching him led away in handcuffs didn't bring me joy. If anything, it saddened me. Here was a man who had once commanded boardrooms, reduced to sneaking through the dark like a thief. It was the perfect metaphor for everything he'd built, shiny on the outside, rotten underneath. After that night, I finally stopped worrying about him. His fall was complete, and the community could breathe again. From that point on, peace truly settled over Callaway Fields. The land began to flourish in ways that went beyond the physical. The gardens blossomed with color, the creek ran clearer than it had in decades, and families who had once been divided by fear began working together. We established annual Founders Day celebrations, not to honor me, but to commemorate the resilience of everyone who had lived through the ordeal. Each year, the residents gathered for a fair in the park where the old HOA office had once stood. Children played games, local musicians performed, and at sunset, we held a moment of silence for my grandfather and all the people who had fought for integrity. It became a tradition, a ritual of gratitude and remembrance. The first year we held it, Teresa stood beside me as fireworks lit up the sky and said, "You've built something that'll outlive all of us." I smiled. That's the idea. But even in peace, I couldn't stop thinking about the deeper meaning of everything that had happened. The whole saga had started because a group of people believed ownership could be faked, that land was just numbers on a page, something to manipulate for profit. They'd forgotten that land holds memory. It carries the weight of those who came before, the work of hands and hearts. My grandfather had understood that. I had to learn it the hard way. So I started writing journals at first, then essays chronicling every step of the ordeal, the deception, the trial, the rebuilding. I wasn't sure why at first, but eventually I realized I wanted others to know that ordinary people could still stand up to corruption and win. A local publisher caught wind of the story and asked to compile it into a book. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted the attention again, but Teresa encouraged me. "Tell it your way," she said, not as a revenge story, but as a redemption one. So I did. The book, titled The Land Remembers, came out the following year and, to my surprise, became a regional bestseller. People wrote to me from across the country, farmers, landowners, even small-town lawyers, saying my story had inspired them to defend their own rights. For the first time, I realized the fight hadn't just saved my land. It had reminded others that truth still mattered. One evening, a few months after the book's release, I stood once more by the edge of the creek where it all began. The sun was low, painting the water in gold, and the air carried the faint laughter of children from the park nearby. I knelt, touched the soil, and felt its cool dampness against my palm. It struck me then that land is more than property, it's a living witness. It remembers who nurtured it, who abused it, who fought for it. My grandfather's spirit, I imagined, was there in that quiet, in the whisper of the wind through the reeds. I whispered back, "We did it." The rippling water seemed to answer. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace, not because I'd won a legal war, but because the land was finally free from deceit, restored to the purpose it was always meant for. The years that followed were kinder than I ever expected. Callaway Fields, reborn from scandal and greed, had become a model of honest community living. Families grew roots there. Children rode their bikes along the same roads where bulldozers once roared, and the old scars of conflict slowly turned into quiet lessons engraved in memory. My own life shifted too. The legal battles had ended, the anger had faded, and for the first time in a long while, I could wake up without feeling the weight of a fight waiting for me. I still lived on the same piece of land in the same farmhouse that my grandfather had built, but now it stood surrounded by laughter instead of tension. The mornings began with the sound of church bells and the hum of conversation from the farmer's market that had replaced the HOA's old parking lot. The irony wasn't lost on me that the place once ruled by deception now thrived on fairness and cooperation. Yet, beneath all the peace, there lingered a quiet awareness that everything I had built was balanced on the thin line between vigilance and trust, and I intended to never let it slip again. Each morning, I walked the perimeter of my land, as I'd done since the beginning. It wasn't about suspicion anymore, it was about connection. The smell of the soil after a night's rain, the shimmer of dew on the grass, it grounded me. I often thought about the absurdity of it all. 96 homes built on stolen land, millions spent to fabricate a lie, and in the end, nature reclaimed it with quiet grace. The oak tree near the creek had grown wider. Beneath its shade, I'd placed a small bench with a brass plaque engraved with the words, "Truth takes root." Sometimes neighbors joined me there. One of them was an elderly man named Harris, who had been one of the first residents of Callaway Fields after the restoration. He'd been skeptical of me at first, like many were, thinking I'd eventually turn into just another authority figure, another version of the HOA. But over time, he became one of my closest friends. He said one morning, sipping from his mug of black coffee, "You could have sold this place for a fortune after all this. Developers are still sniffing around." I smiled. "I know, but it's not for sale. Not ever." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Your grandfather would be proud." I believed him. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a regional land stewardship conference in the state capital. They wanted me to share the story of Callaway Fields, the fraud, the trial, the rebirth, as an example of community-driven recovery. I wasn't sure I wanted to relive it all again, but part of me knew it was important. The drive, there was long, cutting through rolling hills and endless stretches of farmland. When I finally stood at the podium in front of hundreds of faces, lawyers, activists, environmentalists, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I spoke not as a victim, not even as a victor, but as a witness to what happens when people refuse to surrender what's rightfully theirs. I told them about my grandfather, the stolen deed, the sleepless nights, and the courtroom showdown that changed everything. I talked about how corruption thrives in silence, and how ordinary people armed with patience and truth can dismantle it piece by piece. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then came the applause, not thunderous, but warm, genuine, almost reverent. A young woman approached me afterward, tears in her eyes. She said her family had lost their farm years ago to a fraudulent zoning scheme, and that hearing my story gave her hope to fight back. That was when I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been robbed of something they loved and had found the courage to take it back. When I returned home that evening, the air felt lighter somehow, as if the land itself had been listening. I walked down to the creek where the moonlight shimmered on the water. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of life from the neighborhood. Children laughing, dogs barking, music drifting from open windows. The houses built during the dark days of deceit now stood as symbols of restoration. Their owners, many of whom had once been victims of the HOA's manipulation, had turned them into homes filled with warmth and pride. I thought about how ironic it was that those houses, born of corruption, had become places of healing. Maybe that's the way of things. Even what begins in wrong can, through effort and time, find its way back to right. Over the next few years, the community story attracted attention beyond our state. Journalists wrote features about the town that reclaimed its land, and university students visited to study the restoration efforts. Some developers tried to buy me out again, offering absurd sums of money, promising eco-friendly luxury expansion. Each time, I smiled politely and said, "No, thank you," because I understood something they didn't. The value of land isn't in its price, it's in its history. You can't put a dollar figure on legacy. Around the 5th anniversary of the final court ruling, we organized a massive celebration. Hundreds gathered in the park, residents, local officials, even the judge who had presided over the case. There were speeches, fireworks, and a small ceremony unveiling a stone monument with the inscription, "Justice restored, may the land always remember." Standing before that monument, I felt the weight of every moment that had led there, the sleepless nights, the betrayal, the triumph, the healing. It was all worth it. That night, after the festivities ended, I stayed behind as the park emptied. The soft glow of lanterns hung in the trees, and the smell of barbecue still lingered in the air. I walked alone toward the edge of the field where my grandfather's old windmill still stood, its blades creaking softly in the wind. I thought about him, about how all of this had started with a single dusty deed found in an old wooden box. It amazed me how something so small could change so many lives. I whispered, "We did it, old man." For a moment, the wind stilled, and then it carried a gentle rustle through the grass, as if the land itself was answering. In that stillness, I understood something I hadn't before. Victory isn't about defeating your enemies, it's about restoring balance. The HOA had taken so much, not just from me, but from the spirit of the community. By fighting back, by exposing them, by rebuilding, honestly, I hadn't just reclaimed acres of soil, I'd restored faith. Faith in law, in truth, in the idea that integrity still had power in a world too quick to compromise. That realization settled deep inside me, like peace finally earned. As I turned back toward home, the night sky stretched wide above, endless and calm. The lights of the houses twinkled like stars scattered across the earth, each one representing a story of survival and renewal. And for the first time since the fight began, I realized the land no longer needed me to guard it. It had learned to stand on its own. The morning of the 10th anniversary of the Callaway, Field's judgment arrived with the kind of quiet that only comes from balance. The air still, the sun rising gently, and the land stretching awake, in peace. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist drift lazily above the fields. It struck me how much time had passed, and how little I missed the chaos that once defined my days. The farmhouse had been restored completely. The same beams my grandfather had set decades ago still held it strong. The scent of pine mixed with the aroma of brewing coffee, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed. Life had returned to the land in ways I could never have imagined back when it was filled with lawyers, bulldozers, and anger. Callaway Fields was now a living testament to perseverance, families tending gardens, kids playing in the park, old neighbors meeting for coffee beneath the oak tree where I'd placed that plaque years ago. Truth takes root. And it truly had. That morning, I planned to meet Teresa downtown for brunch. We had remained close through the years, not just as lawyer and client, but as friends bound by a shared story. On the drive there, I passed through roads that used to be construction sites filled with shouting foremen and cement trucks. Now they were lined with flower beds and mailboxes painted in bright colors. People waved as I drove by, not out of curiosity, but out of familiarity. That was the most beautiful thing about the new Callaway Fields. It wasn't built on fear or power, but on community. When I reached the cafe, Teresa was already waiting at our usual corner table, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You're late," she teased as I sat down. "You're early," I replied. We laughed. For a while, we just talked about ordinary things, her plans to start a small firm dedicated to land rights, my ongoing project teaching local kids about property stewardship. Then, between sips of coffee, she said, "Do you ever think about how different it all could have been if you hadn't found that deed?" I nodded. Every day. But maybe it wasn't about finding it. Maybe it was about being ready when I did. She smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "You always were." After brunch, we took a walk through the old courthouse square, the same place where the verdict had been delivered 10 years ago. It had been renovated since then, the old oak benches replaced with new ones, the fountain restored. Standing there, I could still hear the echoes of that day, the gavel's strike, the collective gasp, the feeling of triumph washing over exhaustion. "You ever wonder what happened to Callaway?" Teresa asked. I had, though I rarely admitted it. The last I'd heard, he'd served time for fraud and tax evasion, then disappeared into obscurity. "He's gone," I said quietly. "But I think about him sometimes, not out of hate, just curiosity. People like him, they build empires on sand and can't understand why it crumbles." Teresa nodded slowly. Maybe his downfall was necessary to teach others. Every community has its Callaway, after all. She was right. The story had long stopped being about one man's greed. It had become a lesson written into the soil that no power, no deception can hold forever against truth. That evening, the community hosted a gathering at the park for the anniversary. There were lights strung between trees, tables filled with food, and a small stage for speeches. I hadn't planned to say anything, but as the crowd settled, someone handed me the microphone. Faces turned toward me, young and old, familiar and new. I looked out over them and felt a lump rise in my throat. 10 years ago, I began, this land was almost lost, not just legally, but morally. We were told that paper and power meant more than honesty, that the few could take from the many and get away with it. But standing here today, I see what happens when people refuse to be silent. The crowd listened quietly. We didn't just win a court case, we won back our faith in fairness. This land is more than property, it's a promise. And as long as we honor that promise, it'll stay free. Applause rose around me, soft at first, then stronger. I felt something in my chest ease, not pride, but gratitude. As the night deepened, the celebration turned to laughter and music. Kids ran barefoot in the grass. Lanterns floated into the sky, glowing like stars drifting toward the heavens. I sat by the creek again, my place of reflection, watching the lights ripple on the water. My thoughts wandered to my grandfather. I imagined him standing beside me, arms folded, that same quiet strength in his eyes. "You kept it safe?" I could almost hear him say. I whispered, "I just did what you would have done." The night air carried his silence as a kind of blessing. In that moment, I realized something profound. Justice isn't a single event. It's a living thing, it breathes, it grows, it must be tended like a garden. If left unattended, weeds of greed will always return. But if nurtured with vigilance and truth, it flourishes for generations. Over time, Callaway Fields grew beyond anything I could have envisioned. The park expanded, new schools opened, and young couples built homes on land once steeped in dispute. I saw the first generation of children raised in peace become adults with a sense of pride rooted in history. Some of them studied law, others architecture, agriculture, or community planning, each inspired by the story of how their neighborhood came to be. The local high school even added a small elective titled The Land Case of Callaway Fields, teaching students not just about property law, but about ethics, persistence, and civic courage. Every time I visited the class to speak, I ended with the same words. Land doesn't belong to those who own it. It belongs to those who honor it. And the students, bright-eyed and idealistic, always nodded like they understood, maybe more than I ever had at their age. By the time another decade rolled around, I was older, slower, and far more reflective. The world had changed, technology had advanced, and the land had aged gracefully along with me. I spent my mornings tending the same soil my grandfather once plowed, and my evenings writing letters I never sent, to him, to Teresa, even to Callaway. Letters about lessons learned, about how even destruction can be the seed of creation. I wrote about how the land forgives, how truth always finds its way back to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it. And on one golden autumn evening, I buried those letters beneath the oak tree by the creek. It felt right, a final act of closure. Years later, when my time finally came and the house stood quiet once more, I knew the land would go on without me. The community had made sure of that. They'd written into the local charter that Callaway Fields could never again be sold or developed for corporate use. It would remain forever protected, a living monument to integrity. And perhaps, somewhere in the soft hum of the wind, through those trees, my grandfather's voice would linger, mingled with mine, whispering to anyone who stopped to listen. Truth takes root, and in that the land story and mine found its final piece. Sheaf of rice.